we live yet?
Yeah, everyone can hear you.
You're not on here.
Okay. I would be quiet if I was you. What? Is your laptop? I want to see the comments. I can't see them anywhere. I can hold them. No, I got no more about it. All right, let's watch it. Good morning. Oh no. Okay, there we go. Okay. We'll wait a little bit. For some more people to hop in. Currently, it's myself viewing and you viewing. If you want to read ahead a little bit, we're in chapter 38, Job chapter 38. We're going to read the whole chapter. It'll be the whole chapter of Job chapter 38. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? But let's wait a little bit for a few more people. What's up, man? Well, you said something. Just waiting for a few more people to hop in before I get started. So if you remember last time, if you were here last time, we were still in Job, and we were talking about the meaning of friendship. And if you remember that, there were, certain aspects of being a true friend. And this time, outlined in the way Job's companions were behaving. We talked about how true friends should be, empathetic and should come to an understanding and be supportive of each other, and they were not that. And then we also talked about how our one true friend, Jesus Christ, is the embodiment of all that, and that we should look to him for everything. And good morning. And so this time we are in Job 38, and we are at the point now where everyone's had their day to say something, or multiple days, and even, you have all of Job's friends. I believe it was 4 friends speak to him, and then you had his significant other speak to him, and then you have Job speak on his behalf, and everyone's had to say up until this point. And today is the day that finally somebody else gets to speak. And this person is actually God. And in chapter 38, God, for the first time, not for the first time, but for the first time to Job, is speaking. And so this is a pretty big deal because, as you know, this is kind of the whole point that Job has really been kind of under the weather. He's just been, his main criticism is that he felt like he was being abandoned because of everything that's happened. And now God's finally speaking to him. So we'll see how that plays out. For a little bit of background here, in the immediate context, we can we look at immediately preceding this conversation, Elihu, which is one of Job's friends, actually probably one of his better friends, actually rebuked those people that we talked about earlier in last week. He actually said, "You guys are being bad friends." And so Elihu was the youngest of his friends, and he was rebuking the other three men that he was talking to. And he also not only rebuked them, but he also rebuked Job in some kind of case. But he was a little bit better than those other three guys, just a tiny bit in his actions. He rebuked Job for declaring, his righteousness and contending against God and proclaiming God's justice, and he was condemning the self-righteousness and trying to exalt God's goodness and all of that. And while we might expect in this chapter for Job to answer Elihu, we don't see that. It's actually God answering everything that's happened up to this point. So that's the immediate context there. Is that instance. We're immediately coming off of Elihu's sort of commentary. And now when we jump into the first couple verses of this chapter, and we really get to dive into some good stuff here. And if we read the first 4 verses, it says this. Job chapter 38 says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, 'Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me.'" So this has got to be scary, for one. You're talking about over the previous, here then the Lord speaks over the previous 35 chapters since Job 1 and 2. God has been absent from this account in Job, and not absent, but just not talking. And we read really nothing of God's direct role in comforting or speaking to or sustaining or doing anything to Job. And in the midst of this crisis that he's going through, and we're all familiar with the crisis, and over that time, and this whole entire time, Job has ached repeatedly to receive a word from God, and he hasn't been able to get any sort of feedback from God. But here, God's finally speaking in this chapter, and the Lord answers Job, and significantly, this is important because God did not immediately or directly answer anybody but Job. He didn't answer his friends. He didn't answer, any of his other doubters or his significant others or family members or anything like that. He didn't answer anyone but Job, right? And so God answers Job, and that's important to notice or to sort of take note of because of the fact that of Job's relationship with God. This whole time he's been aching because of he felt like God was becoming absent from his life, and in this moment where he's being rebuked, it's almost like a double-edged sword. It's like a sigh of relief that he's finally getting to talk to God, but also it's like, oh, he's got to feel that pain, that sting that of God unleashing on him, and that's got to be pretty scary. But in this particular case, God answers Job basically out of a whirlwind. It says out of a storm in the first verse. It says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm." And what's interesting to note is that the fact that he answers him out of a storm is actually kind of interesting, because that was the very thing that Job was one of the very things that Job felt like God would destroy him through. And this is, you can see this in Job chapter 9, I believe, verse 17, and also verse 3 and 32 and 35 of chapter 9. And it basically, and all throughout chapter 9, I believe. And basically, Job is fearing this whole entire time that God would crush him with a storm, or that God would overwhelm him with his great, great power. And in this instance, right, in this very, very instance, God is speaking through the storm, and that's got to be scary. His one biggest fear is like coming to fruition here and happening directly to him. And also, if we remember what happens, or we remember the immediate context preceding this, Elihu, one of the youngest friend of the four, I believe, basically alluded to this. You know, if you read in chapter 37, this whole entire time, he's speaking about God's great power, and he's alluding to the storm that's on the horizon. And on the horizon, this storm is coming, and this whole time he's using that as a symbolism to illustrate God's power. And in verse 38, we see that storm front had arrived, and speaking through that storm is God. And one of Job's fears was that he would be destroyed by that storm. Not specifically that storm, but the metaphorical storm. And in this account, you know, God is calling Job to account, right? He says, who is this that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? You know, in this verse here, it's some people think they're talking about, some scholars think that this verse is actually speaking to Elihu, and some say it's probably Job, and some say it's both, right? But what this verse says here is Job, like, this whole entire time, he's speaking on things that he has no knowledge of, and you got to be thinking to yourself, man, Job is a true believer and follower of God. It was the only reason that he was being tested to begin with. You know, what could possibly Job not understand about God? But God is saying, Job, you know nothing, and that's got to be pretty scary here. That this devout follower, the most upright man that you know, in this particular instance that we're talking about, and he says, you know, you have no knowledge. You don't know. You don't understand what you're speaking of. And you know, we kind of wonder who this question is being directed to, but the point still remains. You know, we shouldn't think that God in this case is expecting them to know what they could not know, and rather he expected them to appreciate that there were aspects to matters known to God but hidden to man, and these aspects made sense of what seemed to make no sense. He is telling Job, he's telling Elihu, he's telling all of these people that are probably still there and still around. All of his friends are probably still around him at this point, and probably can hear this conversation with God. We don't know, but it's safe to assume that there might be other people in this household still, and listening to this, or watching Job conversate with God at least. And he's saying to them, you need to understand. Right, exactly. And sorry, I just saw the comment. God would often speak in thunder, smoke, mountains, and fire. Yeah, God speaks through many various things in the Bible. Sometimes it's a trumpet, sometimes it's a storm, sometimes it's through the thunder, through the smoke, and through the mountains of fire. Sometimes it was like through a wheel. You know, there's lots of way God likes to speak. And so thank you for that, Esther. And jumping back to where we're at here about the fact that he's speaking without knowledge, we need to understand that there are things that we will never, ever understand, because we cannot understand the way God does things. And for some reason that was lost to Job through this account, through these events. And we're not sure why, but that's the point. That's what happens. And then God tells him in this instance to prepare yourself like a man. He says, I will question you, and you shall answer me. Man, that's gotta be scary. That's like the living God, right? That's Yahweh. Like that's in this case here, the Lord right here is Yahweh, which is like the most exalted name of God in the Hebrew, at least. And And that's who they're referencing. So Yahweh is speaking to him in this case. And he's saying, you will answer to me. All your questions, forget about them. And he's telling, basically not only to Job, but to all the other friends and everyone that had basically anything to say. He said, those things forget about them. You're going to answer my questions now. And he's telling them to prepare himself like a man and to answer the questions that he has prepared for them. And it's also important to note here that this prepare you like a man statement is in reference to men going off to battle. And I think in the King James versions, I read this somewhere. It says like gird your loins, and that's what it says here. It says gird your loins, and what that basically means is that back then they wore like a dress sort of outfit. It's not a dress, but it was a long tunic cloak kind of thing, and they would pull up their tunic and tie it off with a rope, and that's what it meant to gird your loins. And once they did that, they were ready to battle. They could actually move and do all these things. And he's telling them, like, you better be ready for battle. You better be ready to run and to fight here in this case. And this is all just based off questioning, which is pretty cool. Or pretty serious questioning, I should say. So now let's get into the questioning. So the questioning here starts off right there in verse 4. And I'm gonna go like pretty much verse by verse here. I'll read verses 4 to 7 and then continue on to go through those line by line. Okay, verse 4 says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand who marked off its dimensions. Surely you know who stretched a measuring line across it. On what were its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy." Exactly. Whenever we question God's justice today, we are speaking words without knowledge. And we'll expand upon that point a little bit later. And verses 4 through 7 that I just read, let's kind of go through them. And because this is a direct challenge to Job's supposed authority, self-righteousness, I would say. Elihu kind of spoke to it earlier in chapter 37. And so let's go through the verse 4 real quick. It says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And so the intention of this question is obvious, right? Job was not around when God created earth. Like, come on. He was nowhere to be found when God laid the foundations of the earth. God was ancient in his power, right? In his might. And Job can never be considered to be on the same level as God. And neither can any of us be considered to be on the same level as God. So if we put that into perspective, when you come to God with questions, when you come to God with things that you need answered, like you have to realize is that there are things that we will never know, just like Job, and we will never be able to understand them. We weren't there when God created the earth. We did not determine the measurements. We weren't there when the stars were singing. And let's read some of these verses here. It says the next verse is, "Tell me if you understand who marked off its dimensions. Surely you know who stretched a measuring line across it." Job was not present at the creation of the world, like I said. He had no understanding of the measurements, the foundations, or anything. And he would not have possibly known, even if he lived for another 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years. This is something that even today we don't understand. Job could possibly not have understood it. And so when Job was questioning God this whole entire time, he said, wait, buddy. You're speaking on things you have no understanding of. You think you know what I do, but my plan is not your plan. And so that is that is the gist of what's going on here. And this will continue to go on throughout this entire chapter here. When the next verse, it says, "On what were its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy." This is actually this last part here. It tells us that, like, not only were you not there, this angel is shouting for joy, but there were people there, or not people, angelic beings there. So like, not only were you not there, but there were other people witnessing this whole entire thing go down. He says that the angelic beings, the morning stars, the sons of God, right here, this is referencing the angels, did in fact witness this creation go down, right? And they rejoiced and they sang, and they, with all the glory and power of your creation and wisdom of God, they rejoiced. And so not only was Job not there, but there were other people there. It's just God further pointing out to Job that he is basically far beneath his understanding. And it's not in a belittling or negative way. It's just, you cannot be compared to the understanding of God. Let's read verses 8 through 11. Verses 8 through 11, it says, "Who shut up the sea behind doors when it bursts forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place. When I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt." What you have to understand here is that we are in maybe like 1000 BC. I don't actually know the exact date on when this happens, but it's like 4,000 years, 3,000 years ago. You know, it's a long time ago. And when you get this question here about the sea, it's significant to understand what time period this is. And this is, like I said, thousands and thousands of years ago. The sea to them is a great mystery still. And even to us, you know, I think I heard somewhere that even now, like the bottom of the ocean, we know more about the moon than the ocean, like the bottom of the ocean. And isn't that crazy? Like, we live here and we know more about the moon, which is 100 whatever thousand miles away, or kilometers or million, whatever it is, and we know more about the moon than the ocean. And so in this case, we're thousands of years more far advanced. But back then, the sea was a great mystery to these people, right? Very, very, very great mystery. And because of that mystery and that sort of uncertainty there was a lot of divinity around the ocean. And it was very, very powerful, and often it is referenced in many of the biblical stories, the power of the ocean and the storms and when people are out on the sea. And so this specific reference here is referencing when he's talking about the who shut the sea, it says, who shut up the sea behind doors when it bursts forth from the womb. He's literally talking about the birth of the ocean, and that's like the second or third day of creation. And he's literally talking about, is Job actually the oldest book in the Bible? That's actually interesting. I don't know what period this is, but it's a long time ago, like very, very, very long. I don't know the period of when this actually, the actual date on this. I don't even know if people know that. Let me see if it's in here. No, there's no, I don't have a date. It's not specified. But anyway, not in my Bible at least. So the reference here is about being birthed through, like, the womb, in essence, is about the actual creation of the ocean. He's like, were you there when I created the ocean? Just like previously he said, were you there when I created the earth? And the answer is no, you weren't there. And it's kind of cool because this whole entire time he's almost acting like the vast and great expanse of the ocean is like a little baby. And you can kind of tell God is referencing that a little bit by the words he uses. Who shut up this? He says, who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst from the womb, right? Like as being born. And he made clouds as its garment. He put little clothes on it, right? And and he wrapped it, right? He wrapped it like a little baby, like a little, like in a bassinet or something, and with thick darkness. So this whole entire time he's referencing like this vast, vast ocean. Like God is referencing this vast, vast ocean. It's like nothing more than just a little baby, right? And it's pretty cool symbology there. And the fact that it's true, like this vast ocean that the ancients were so scared of and had no understanding of, and it was extremely powerful. Like in God's hands, it's nothing. It's nothing but a little baby, a little child. And that's some pretty cool symbolism there that you can take note of. Job had no understanding of how God did any of that. Didn't understand how God set the boundaries for the sea. He maybe knew that the boundaries existed, but he couldn't explain or why or exactly how they got there, right? And so that's just score number 2 for God. He's like, Job, you don't know how the earth was created? You don't know how the sea was created. What else does he not know? So let's continue. In verses 12 through 18, it says, have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edge and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their lights, and their upraised arms broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Once again, I know more than you, is God is telling him. This first portion here, this first verse that we just read here, I think it's 12, it says, have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place? This is a pretty awesome question for God to ask. He's like, Job, have you made morning to come even once? Like all the days of your life, have you ever said, let it be morning? or woken up and be like, I did that right there, and I made the sun rise. And the answer is no. Not possible. Is it even in his power to do it? No, not possible. This is all God's power, all God's divine authority. When he says, have you entered the springs of the sea? Right? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea and rocked the recesses of the depth? Job probably doesn't even know what this is, or I was trying to look into it, and it was actually pretty convoluted. I was like, this is so crazy. Like now God is speaking on things that not even modern science would know. So he talks about the gates of death and the breadth of the earth. He's speaking to all these things that maybe Job had some minor understanding of, but never could have possibly have known any of it. And even today, these questions, there are many questions that God is presenting that we do not even know. In verses 19 to 24, it says this: what is the way to the abode of light? And where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? Surely you know, for you were already born. You've lived so many years. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? What? So the question is, was Job prepared for this mental test? Would he be able to defend himself on the charge of presumption? And you're always, so that's a good question. And although I don't know if it's spoken to, I'm not exactly sure if the Lord or or Job had spoken to that previously. But to answer it about any test, you're always going to be able to overcome your circumstances. God's not going to give you a test that you cannot overcome. And perhaps failing is the test. Sometimes even like failing at what you're doing is the point. That was the test. That is the correct course. And so as far as whether or not Job was prepared for this mental test, you're always going to be able to. God's not going to give you a test that you cannot overcome. God's not going to give you something that you cannot, or no, I'm not saying you cannot. With God's help, you cannot overcome. You will be able to, with God's help, do anything. And so would he be able to defend himself on the charge of being presumptuous? I mean, he had a very close, he had a very close relationship with God as far as the presumptuous part of this. And I don't necessarily know if he was being incredibly presumptuous, but I guess that's up to with him and God. I'm not sure about that one. But anyway, let's continue on. Sorry about that. I was trying to answer a good question from Hermana there. So I would have to read a little bit more about the presumptuous part of it. That's a pretty deep little. That's pretty deep right there. I'd have to do some digging on whether or not he would be able to defend himself on presumption, on the charge of presumption. Anyway, so sorry, let's go back. It says, "Do you comprehend the nature of light, darkness in the sky?" And we just talked about it. He's talking about snow, he's talking about hail, he's talking about rain, he's talking about lightning, he's talking about everything right here. And he says, and also light, which is interesting. He says, where is the way to the dwelling of light? God is asking him, Job, do you know where light comes from, right? Do you know its nature and its source? He's like, and he asks him, he's like, do you know it? Like, surely you should know it because you've been born in the world and you've lived for so long. Surely you know it. Perhaps Job was so old and wise that he did indeed know these things. If this were the case, God basically invited him to speak. He's like, do you know it? Do you know where this comes from? And although we may, like modern science now, may come to some understanding of this, but even still, there's mystery to it. He asked them, have you seen the storehouses where you have the hail, where you have the rain, right? Where he reserves these things for times of trouble, for days of battle and war. And on several occasions, we know this in the Bible, in biblical record, God used hail, bombs, missiles, or whatever, from heaven. Some people call it meteorites or whatever, destroying things. Many times to communities that were hostile to him, right? And his people. Hail is a frequently used tool of judgment, right? Against God's enemies. We see this in Egypt, right? In Exodus. Apparently it's also in many other places. And one of those places was on the Canaanites and Joshua, I believe. And also in Ezekiel and in many cases, we see throughout the Bible that hail, that destroying things through rocks of fire is a common theme. And God is asking him, do you know where those things come from? When I destroyed these places? Once again, the answer is no. Job couldn't have possibly knew or understood any of these things. And so, when we're continuing on to chapter verses 25 to 30, it says this. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water? A land where no man lives, a desert with no one in it. To satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass. Does the rain have a father who fathers the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens? When the waters become hard as stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen. That's right. No one's going to understand or ever match the creative power of God. In this case, it's basically a follow-up from what we just read in the previous verses. He's asking Job, come on, man. Like you've been aching and crying out for me this whole entire time, saying that you know this and that you know that. And the thing is do you even understand the rain and its effects? Something as simple as rain. Do you know it? And in the previous section, God spoke to his own wisdom of his management of everything. Of snow, of rain, of hail, of lightning, of light, even where light comes from. And here he's speaking to even more of his great power and glory. He's simply explaining his own greatness in a way. And he's asking Job, he's like, do you even know how I make these things? You don't. Previously in the chapter 36 and 37, Elihu stated many, many times he was using the storms and he was using the cycle of the rain cycle and the water and everything to demonstrate God's greatness, right? As an example of showing as an example of God's greatness. And here God's saying, yeah, I know how to do these things. I created these things, and I designed them, and I maintain them, and I do all these things. All these things that you think just happen, they don't just happen. I created them. I know where they come from. Where does the river come from? Where do the canyons come from? Where do the mountains come from? They come from me, and that's what God's saying. That's what God's saying here. In this rebuke of, it's not necessarily a rebuke more, well, it might be. This rebuke of Job just kind of continues. We talked about it. We talked about the earth. We talked about the sea. We talked about all of nature, all the rain, all of the different mysterious things, lightning. We talked about hail. We talked about the sun, where light comes from. We talked about the rivers. We talked about snow, and now we're going to talk about the heavens. So every question to this point, Job has no understanding of, or at least not a full, complete understanding of. He might even know a little. Let's give him some credit, right? He's pretty a wise guy. And when we talk about the next part, it's like, okay, now I know you know nothing. And this next part is verse 31 and 33, and it says this: Can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the corns of Orion? Can you bring forth the constellations in their season, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? So where are we at now? We're up in the stars, right? And so can you bring out the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loosen the cords of Orion? And if you don't know what these are constellations. These are constellation. These are stars, right? And the stars, and when you look up at the night sky, they sometimes create images and they create arrangements, and that's what is being referenced here. Pleiades and Orion and the bear and the cubs. All of these things are references to the constellations. And once again, God is not merely challenging Job on his lack of knowledge. He's exposing Job's lack of might and greatness, right? In comparison to God, right? That's exactly what he's doing. He didn't manage Job does not manage to master or change any of the stars or in the constellations in the sky, but God can. With these high and almost outrageous examples, we need to understand that pointing out what Job doesn't know, we need to understand that God's purpose here was not to humiliate Job. At least I don't think. And I think there's some, I was reading some things, and it seems like the point to this was not to humiliate Job, right? He's basically just trying to demonstrate to Job that God is omniscient. He's omnipotent, right? And man is not. That's the point of what's going on. It's not to humiliate Job, although it is rather humiliating. The point is to demonstrate to Job that there are things beyond his understanding, and that he should take comfort that the all-powerful God is in control of his plans, control of his life. Because where would you be without him, right? Like many in the ancient world here, Job probably understood these arrangements and constellations. That's how they got around, actually. A lot of times, the maps probably weren't that necessarily that good. They got around at night by, if they were ship goers, they used the stars and constellations to travel. So, and the stars and constellations were thought to possess signs of divinity, right? So many scholars would actually study them for signs of God's presence and whatnot. And so there was some understanding of the constellation. So he might have knew a little bit about it, but right. Exactly. And God shows that Job, or God is showing Job that he takes care of his creations here in a sec also. At the end of in 39 to 41, and actually in all of chapter 39 also, he does speak to this, what your point is here. Let's read verses 34 to 38. So it says, "Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with the flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, 'Here we are'? Who endowed the heart with wisdom, or gave understanding to the mind? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together?" No. The answer is no. Right? Can you lift your voice into the clouds? Right? Job does not possess this power. He's powerless over the starry sky and the constellation. He was powerless over the clouds and lightning. He was powerless over all natural phenomena. That's God's domain, both far and near to him. When God asks him, who puts wisdom in the mind, or who gives understanding to the heart? Job is a man of intelligence, right? Job does have wisdom. And this intelligence is not Job's wisdom, not Job's intelligence, right? It's given to him. It's given to him by the designer, by God. Like all men, Job's intellectual capacity here, in referencing here, is not a product of Job. It is a product of God. With all the increased knowledge that we have in this world, it's as wonderful and glorious as it is, we're really not any closer to understanding these questions. And that is crazy. This is the oldest book in the Bible that, apparently, I believe Esther had mentioned that. And God's questions to Job can still not be answered in 2020. These questions in Job, like scientifically at least, cannot be explained without God. They cannot be answered. I bet you in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, these questions will still not be answered without God. And that's got to be awe-inspiring. That's got to speak to the power of God, really. That we will have generations and generations and generations and generations of kids and grandkids and whoever, and they will still not be any closer to the truth than I was, than you are, than Job was, than Moses or whoever, right? And that's pretty cool to think about. When verses 39 to 41 say this. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crunch in their dens or lie in wait in the thicket? Who provides for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack for food? This is sort of the culmination of everything. We talked about earth, we talked about the sea, we talked about the nature, all of the natural sort of order that goes on, the rain, the lightning, the hail, the snow, the sleet, the rivers, the mountains, things like that. Not the mountains, I mean. And then we talked about the constellations, so in the sky. And now we talked about the last thing that there is to talk about, and that's the animals. This is now all of creation at this point that God has spoke to. And when you ask someone, do you know something? And they basically say, do you know anything? Because I just spoke about all creation. It's got to be pretty scary. It's, man, I understand. I know nothing. I thought I knew a little bit about the rain or how the rain got there. Maybe I thought I knew a little bit how the sun got there, or maybe I thought I knew a little bit about how animals even get their food. But the reality is I don't. And that's what God's trying to give Job a little humble pie there and say, you don't know nothing. In his speech to Job here, God moved from like the distant expanse and constellations down to the clouds, to the human mind, and still further down to like the animals. And Job could not even understand this part. Therefore, in this particular case, I guess it was a little presumptuous of Job to demand answers for God. If that's his whole point here, through chapter 2 to, I guess, 37, he would basically tell to his friends that, hey, just wait till God comes back. He'll vindicate me. He will respond to your criticism, and he will back me up. And it's true, but he had no right to presume that. God will back him up, right? God is backing him up, but he's like, man, you got to stop speaking onto things that you know nothing about. So I guess in that particular instance, he is presumptuous here. God provides everything for us. Thank you, Ramona. And he provides for the birds. He provides for the animals. He provides for you and me. And he's reminding Job the distance between himself and Job. The distance between a human and an omnipresent being is vast. But that vastness, we need to take heart into understanding that vastness between us and God is bridged, right? It's bridged. We have a path to that. And that path, I think we all need to understand after coming out of this questioning, that this closeness to God, that he may seem so far away, but through Jesus Christ, we can actually be close to God. And not just close. I'm talking about like right up next to him. We are with God. God is in us if we have Jesus Christ. And that's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome to think about after getting to the end of all these questions and coming to the end of this understanding. That's something that we need to understand, guys. I want to read so that we can take comfort in knowing that there is hope in Jesus Christ and God. Let's jump to John chapter 14, and while we close this lesson here. And in John 14, it says in 14 chapter, verse 8, it says this. This is Philip speaking to God, or Jesus. It says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And Jesus answered, Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing this work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe the evidence of the works themselves. Fairly truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will be even greater things than these, because I am doing to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask for anything in my name, and I will do it. If you love me, keep my commands. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever. The Spirit of truth. We need to understand that Jesus is the way to God. Any question you have about God, about creation, about anything that was just here, we go to Jesus, and Jesus will act on our behalf. When you accept Jesus Christ into your heart, he is inside of you. And if you read what Jesus just said there, Jesus is God. And you're accepting the divinity of God inside of you. You basically become, he's a child of God in that instance. So I urge all of you guys to reflect on your relationships with Jesus Christ, that if you're having trouble, please pray and ask God and ask Jesus to be with you. And if you're struggling with any of these questions, you need to take heart into knowing that there is a very, very, very powerful guy on your side, and that you should take heart in knowing that there are things that you do not know, and that's all right, because he's taking care of everything in the background. Anyway, guys, that's my lesson here. I appreciate everybody coming out and watching this, and hopefully we learned a little bit about Job. We learned a little bit about God, and maybe learned a little bit about ourselves, and maybe we can reflect on that. So thank you, guys. I don't know what time it is. It's 10:22. I guess I'll just end this in prayer, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you. Let's bow our heads. Dear God, thank you for another wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day of life. We pray that the mysteries of the world here don't confuse us, confound us, and lead us astray from you, God. We pray that you be with us in the understanding of everything that this world has to offer. We pray that anybody who wasn't able to make it today, God, to this lesson, that you be with them, that you encourage them, that you nourish their spirit and lead them on the path of righteousness to Jesus Christ, God. We pray that you be with everyone out there, that this story, that we spoke it truthfully and that it honored you and glorified you, God. We pray that this story nourishes the spirits of everyone who may hear it. In your name we pray, God. Amen. All right. Thanks, guys.